Hello everybody and welcome to Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. And as always, it's your one-stop shop to take stock of all the progress on the political and literal battlefields, which for the third week in a row brings us to Russian territory. Well, let's go ahead now and get started. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi offered his role as a friend to bring peace to Ukraine in a meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv. Observers hope that India could help mediate between Kyiv and Moscow. The visit, however, came just weeks after Modi's meeting with Vladimir Putin in Moscow.
The visit of Indian Prime Minister in Kyiv started with commemoration of Ukrainian children killed in the war. After talks between the heads of the state concluded, Modi stressed that India was committed to helping end the war.
No conflict can be resolved on the battlefield. The road to resolution can only be found through dialogue and diplomacy. And we should move in that direction without wasting any time. Both sides should sit together to find ways to end this crisis.
Representatives of India and Ukraine have also signed documents on cooperation in various fields.
They concern the medical field, agricultural cooperation, humanitarian relations and culture. After the Prime Minister's visit, we prepared a joint statement on the development of strategic cooperation between our countries, trade between our countries and military cooperation. All these shall be strengthened. I'm very grateful for it.
Modi's visit, the first by an Indian leader since Ukraine's independence, came just weeks after he traveled to Moscow. That symbolic first overseas trip of his new term as leader, where he held talks with President Vladimir Putin, was criticized by Kyiv. India has also acted as an economic lifeline for Russia, increasing purchases of its crude oil after countries around the world imposed sanctions on Moscow.
Ukraine's parliament has ratified the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, making a significant step towards enhancing international justice and accountability. The statute will come into force 60 days after it's received by the UN Secretary General.
Ukraine has ratified the Rome Statute, with an overwhelming majority of lawmakers voting in favor. President Volodymyr Zelensky submitted the ratification bills earlier in August, emphasizing the importance of the move for Ukraine's commitment to international law and its aspirations to join the European Union. The ratification also means that Ukraine will not recognize the ICC's jurisdiction over Ukrainian citizens for war crimes.
The ratification of the Rome Statute will bring change. We will receive the rights of a member of the International Criminal Court, and we will legally be able to establish immunity from the ICC jurisdiction over the Ukrainian military for 7 years.
Ukraine signed the Rome Statute in the year 2000, but had not ratified it until now. The decision to ratify comes in the wake of Russia's invasion, which has underscored the need for robust mechanisms to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity.
The legislation of the Rome Statute will require that all war crimes that originate or have signs of war crimes should be investigated by national authorities, and the military who are now defending us will have to prove in courts that they are not criminals but defenders of Ukraine.
The ratification is a crucial step towards holding Russian officials accountable for alleged war crimes committed during the ongoing conflict. The ICC has already issued arrest warrants for several high-ranking Russian officials, including President Vladimir Putin, for their roles in the forced deportation of Ukrainian children.
And now it's time to look at the situation along the front lines in Ukraine. And of course, this time I'm going to start with the bad news first, because I'm a bad news first kind of guy. We're going to move down to the southern portion of the Eastern Front, near the city of Donetsk. Pokrovsk. This is the city we've been talking about for weeks, actually, as the Russians, of course, for the last few months, rather, as the Russians have taken over Avdiivka, they have inched themselves progressively further to the west, and they are approaching the city of Pokrovsk. Now, there is a major highway that connects Chasiv Yar with Pokrovsk or Konstantinivka, and of course, the Russians are only about 8 kilometers off of that road. It seems that that will prove to be a big problem for Ukrainian logistics in the southern front lines. If that does happen, Ukrainians are warning and evacuating the city, telling all civilians to leave now because it will only get worse. Ukrainians expect within the next 1 to 2 weeks that Pokrovsk will be overrun by Russian forces. There's also a mandatory evacuation right now for children. Children have to be evacuated from that area, which tells us that Ukraine is concerned about that section of the front line, and of course that city being overrun. If it is indeed overrun, we don't know what the consequences of that will be for logistics and for supply of goods and weapons, ammunition, and what have you for other sectors of the front line. So that we will just have to wait and see what happens. It's not a guarantee, but it's something that's starting to picture that's being painted. Now let's go to the good news. The good news is actually over on Russian territory in the Kursk region. Week 3 we're in, where Ukraine has seized a large swath of the Kursk region, as you can see here on the map, around 1,200 square kilometers at this point. And as I mentioned, we're in week 3. This is a big success for Ukrainians. And of course, here the same river, Ukrainians cutting off access for Russian forces at several points along the river where the bridges were, of course using what appears to be HIMARS cluster munitions to take out those bridges, and even attempts to build pontoon bridges by Russian forces, well, they've been taken out by Ukrainians. Now, what does that do for the other side of the river? Well, it leaves a lot of people stranded, including Russian conscripts, which are very vulnerable. It's conscripts and the use of conscripts by Vladimir Putin is a very delicate issue in Ukraine. Because conscripts are not supposed to be involved in combat operations. President Zelensky is saying that this will indeed replenish the exchange fund for Ukraine so that Ukraine can, and has already captured hundreds of, if not thousands of Russian soldiers in this region. Ukraine will be able to trade them for their own prisoners of war at some further date. So that's the situation in Kursk. Of course, we're going to talk about this a lot more coming up, so stay with us. And now it's time to look at the war in Ukraine through the lens of a journalist. And for that, we are joined by our correspondent in Kyiv, Oz Katerji. Hello, Oz. Thanks for joining us on Ukraine this week.
Hello.
Now, Ukrainian attacks on military facilities inside of Russia have been popping up all over the news this week. What can you tell us about some of these strikes?
Sure. There have been multiple that have been reported. Again, we've had mostly the Russians talking about them, but we did get Kirilo Budanov, the head of the SBU, Ukraine Security Services, confirm one of the largest waves of attacks, drone attacks on Russia since the war began. That's according to Russian local authorities. So, yeah, we have several specific ones that happened in recent days. The Volgograd attack on an airbase in Volgograd, said to have reportedly destroyed several planes. There was an attack on a ferry in the Kerch area in near occupied Crimea on the Russian side. That ferry was said to be reportedly transferring fuel tankers to occupied Crimea. So again, another attack targeting critical oil infrastructure. And then we have this attack on an oil facility, the Kavkaz oil facility in the Rostov Oblast. Now that's a very big one. That's something the fire has been burning for several days. Multiple explosions keep being reported. The authorities there really struggling to put that out. It's a major oil depot. So yeah, it's been a case of the Ukrainians striking deeper and deeper into Russian territory. This is the new normal now. Whereas, Russian attacks are very often targeting civilian infrastructure. Ukraine is making use of its long-range assets specifically to target certain things, particularly air bases, naval assets around Crimea, and oil infrastructure that's coming through the border regions of Russia and even far out to the east.
Yeah, the element of surprise is crucial, and it looks like Ukraine's really taking the initiative there. Now, you also have Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visiting Kyiv. Any hopes for some kind of breakthrough? What do you think that President Zelensky, is trying to accomplish in his talks with the Indian Prime Minister?
So this is a very interesting one, because the prelude to this was the Russian attack on Kyiv a few months ago, or weeks even, that attacked the Children's Hospital, Ahmediyat Children's Hospital. Now, this attack happened while Narendra Modi was on a state visit to Russia. And while he was in Russia, President Zelensky tweeted about how disappointing it was to see Modi, and saying it was a devastating blow for peace, for the opportunities for peace. So that happened not so long ago. For Modi to come to Ukraine, and Modi is particularly seen as a Russian partner and famously part of the BRICS group of countries. But that attack on the hospital was seen as quite embarrassing for Modi while he was in India. Now, I will say that Modi's tone here and the tone of his visit diplomatically and in his demeanor has been much more humble, much more respectful than previous state visits from, say, Cyril Ramaphosa, South Africa, or even recently Viktor Orban, Hungary, two traditional Putin allies. And the demeanor of their state visits here were much less humble, put it that way. And then Narendra Modi is really striking a tone that's more commonly seen here on state visits to Western partners, such as the UK or the USA. So to see that here, it does send a message, and that message will be received in Moscow, that Narendra Modi wants this war to end, and he doesn't necessarily see it ending on Russian terms exclusively.
Indeed. Well, Oz Katerji, reporting for us live from Kyiv. Thank you very much for that, and do keep yourself safe. As Ukraine approaches its Independence Day on August 24th, the nation finds itself at a critical juncture. Despite over 2 years of relentless conflict with Russia, Ukraine's economy has shown remarkable resilience. However, the looming threat of increased Russian attacks casts a shadow over these celebrations.
Ukraine's economy has managed to sustain growth despite the ongoing war. The British Minister of Defense has projected a real GDP growth of approximately 3% for Ukraine in 2024. This follows a significant recovery from a 29% GDP decline in 2022, with a 5% growth in 2023. The National Bank of Ukraine has also revised its inflation forecast for 2024 to 8.2%, down from the previous estimate of 8.6%. As Ukraine prepares to mark 33 years of independence from the Soviet Union, the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv has issued a warning of an elevated risk of Russian missile and drone attacks. The embassy's statement highlights the increased threat level in the lead-up to the Independence Day, urging residents to remain vigilant. This warning comes in the wake of a series of Russian strikes that have targeted Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv and Kharkiv. The Ukrainian military has reported significant Russian losses lately, with over 1,100 troops and 42 artillery systems eliminated in a single day in August. Despite the setbacks, however, Russian forces continue to pose a significant threat, particularly as they seek to disrupt Ukraine's Independence Day celebrations. Ukraine's ability to maintain economic progress amid such adversity is a testament to the resilience and determination of its people. However, the ongoing conflict and the threat of further attacks underscores the challenges that lie ahead. As the nation celebrates its independence, the focus remains on securing a stable and prosperous future, even in the face of Russian aggression.
And now joining me to discuss, of course, the upcoming Independence Day in Ukraine and more is Yevheniia Kravchuk, Ukrainian MP from the Servant of the People Party and Deputy Chair of the Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policy in Ukraine. Hello, and thank you very much for joining me on Ukraine this week.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yes. Now, first off, let's talk about the upcoming Independence Day. And we're now in really our third year of since the full-scale Russian invasion. How do you think it's going to look like this year, especially based on what we're seeing, the successes in the Kursk region, but also the dire situation in the Pokrovsk direction?
Well, indeed, it's the basically third year of the war and third Independence Day during the full-scale invasion, because the war is 10 years. But I would say that the mood is rather high, despite, of course, that we have to evacuate people from Donetsk region, from Pokrovsk. But the Kursk operation that came quite successfully and planned very wisely and in the conditions that no one knew, basically, besides the higher command. So it does give some hopes that these not standard moves can change and give the initiative to Ukrainian army. Again, we are, having this Independence Day finally with F-16. Our air defense system is better than a year ago. We received more Patriot system and other types of system. Of course, we need more support and continuous support, but at least we have the decision of G7 that finally said that they will find the way to transfer at least the revenues from the frozen assets, and it's 50 billion. Ukraine is an official candidate, not just official candidate to European Union, but we opened negotiations between last Independence Day and this Independence Day. So it gives, some signs of hope. And besides, we have a Prime Minister of India just on the eve of Independence Day in Kyiv. And this is the first visit of Prime Minister of India in 33 years.
Right, and that's what I wanted to get into next, is exactly, obviously, the Prime Minister was just here in Poland. I have the impression that the Polish authorities kind of softened him up a little bit before he got to Kyiv. But looking at the Indian Prime Minister making this historic visit, because it is historic, how would you say it's going thus far? What do you think are the main goals for President Zelensky to communicate to Prime Minister Modi? Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, India is a big player. It's a huge country. It has 1.4 billion of inhabitants. And before this time, it was seen as the country that is closer, let's say, to Russian side. And Modi actually experienced great criticism when he was on the state visit to Russia just a month ago, at the same day when the children's hospital was attacked. And I think he felt that for his reputation, it came out badly. So part of the reasons probably why this visit to Kyiv is so long, so rich, is that Modi wants to be, on the right side of the history, and we respect that and we value that. We need these allies that are for democracy. If you look at the map of the world, who's supporting Russia openly? North Korea, Iran, China, let's say not that openly, but still they have friendly relations. So we need to not to give India to this team of autocrats.
Right, and India is in a unique position in that China has not been invited anywhere near the peace process, at least thus far. And it seems like India could fill a gap, perhaps, in this process. I think we see a lot of signs pointing to the direction of eventual peace talks, maybe before even the end of the year. I know we have the situation in the United States with the elections, but it also seems like Ukrainians are gearing up to be in a strong position to be able to, if they do need to sit down, if you do need to sit down at the table and talk to Russians to negotiate something, that you'll be in a good, solid position to do so. So what are your thoughts, at least on the process of potential peace talks? Do you believe that this will happen towards the end of the year?
Well, it's not just, some sort of a fetish that we need to sit and talk to Russia. We're not discussing this plan that Russia put on the table, basically, asking for capitulation of Ukraine. It cannot be the case.
Right.
So it's very important that Prime Minister Modi said that we need to respect UN Charter. And UN Charter clearly says that it's against the rules when one country invades another and is changing the borders of other country, is annexing territory and basically ruining the world order that was made after the Second World War. So if we stay on this basis, the negotiations should be on the just terms, not capitulation of Ukraine. And we believe that such visits, when Modi comes to see the memorial of killed children, sees with himself and talks to people that live here, see the resilience of people, it brings another country on the side of normality and common sense in the case of negotiations.
Do you think that India could potentially be one of these bridges?
We hope that India will play a bigger role in the process. We invited India for the second peace summit. They are participating in the topical groups. For example, the food security is interesting for India. They have 1.4 billion people. And of course, they are buying still Russian gas, but we also want to show them that there is another way of, common work and economical ties.
Back to the Independence Day, is there anything planned in the capital, at least? How do you think it's going to look like this year, just based on the current situation?
Well, of course, the Independence Day is probably the day when Russians would like to spoil the day. So we expect, at least air sirens, maybe could be drone attacks or missile attacks. We do not have any massive celebrations. It's during the martial law. It's forbidden, but people probably, I think, will be commemorating those who died for our freedom and independence, and thank those who are fighting right now to keep this independence.
Yes, indeed. Well, I wish everybody there a happy Independence Day. I hope spirits are high. I hope morale is high, especially looking at the situation in the Kursk region. And I wish you all the best. Yevheniia Kravchuk, Ukrainian MP, servant of the people and deputy chair of the Committee on Human Rights and Information Policy. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Ukraine is losing ground in the east, but meanwhile, its troops are moving forward in the Kursk region, partly in an effort to replenish what President Zelensky has called the country's exchange fund. In turn, Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy head of Russia's Security Council, has said that Ukraine's incursion into Russian territory means that there will be no peace talks between Moscow and Kyiv until Ukraine is defeated.
Zelensky's handshake with the Ukrainian army's commander-in-chief says it all. Kyiv claims to have taken over 1,200 square kilometers of land in the wake of the incursion into Russia's Kursk region.
Our operation in the Kursk region continues. Our combat work is ongoing and steps are being taken. We control designated areas.
Ukrainian commander Alexander Syrsky said his troop had advanced up to 35 kilometers into Russian territory, capturing almost 100 settlements. Kyiv's troops have also managed to destroy a few key bridges on the same river, trapping hundreds or even thousands of Russian troops. Subsequent Russian efforts to deploy pontoon bridges have been hindered.
This is the whole purpose of Ukraine's campaign, to bring the war back home to Russians. Russians have been acting like ostriches in the last 3 years. They've been sort of burying their heads in the sand and saying, we don't want to know anything about this war.
Ukraine's rapid incursion into Russia has sent thousands of local residents fleeing the Kursk region. Russian official sources claim 1/5 of all the region's residents have been evacuated.
It's hard to say exactly how much is propaganda, but the facts on the ground appear to be that somewhere between 200 and 250,000 people living in the region where the combat activity is going on have left their home.
Some of those evacuated, however, have ended up in Ukraine, like Oleg and his mother, who both lived in Sudzha, the largest settlement captured by the Ukrainian army.
The local officials just got themselves and their families out. There was no organized evacuation. People tried to get out on their own, but failed.
The incursion into Kursk raises questions for many observers. While Ukraine is deploying many of its resources there, in the east, Russia is on the offensive, with a looming threat of the strategic city of Procr falling into Russian hands.
We have heard both General Syrsky and President Zelensky reveal some of their thinking, and I think some of it does, in fact, relate to using this territory as a bargaining chip at some point in the future, but that point is clearly not now.
Moscow has stated, however, that the incursion makes any peace talks impossible.
And now joining me here on Ukraine This Week to discuss the progress in the Russian region of Kursk and, of course, the situation on Ukraine's front lines is none other than Gen Hodges, former Commander U.S. Army Europe and retired General, former Commander of U.S. Army Europe. Hello, sir. Thank you very much for joining me on Ukraine This Week.
Well, thanks for once again giving me the privilege.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Now, I'd like to start off actually with the bad news first. And the bad news to us seems like the situation in Pokrovsk. It does look like, based on the fact that Ukraine has been ordering its citizens to evacuate, there's a mandatory evacuation for children in place, and it looks like the Russians are inching closer and closer towards the city. So I'd like to ask your opinion, sir, on what does that do to the eastern front line? What does that do for the supply of weapons, equipment, logistics for the other parts of the front line that are dependent on the crossroads there in Pokrovsk?
Well, of course, if you're the commander of Ukrainian forces there, or you are a soldier there in the Pokrovsk area, it sucks. I mean, you're under enormous pressure from Russian forces. You know you don't have enough ammunition to do what needs to be done. But I think that the Ukrainian General Staff has done its analysis, has realized that it has to take some risk in the eastern part of Ukraine in order to launch this counteroffensive in the direction of Kursk, which will have significant strategic effect. So I think we want to put the Pokrovsk situation in context. Avdiivka was captured by the Russians finally after a long fight way back in February. It is only about 50 kilometers from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk. So in other words, It's taken the Russians 6 months to get within 10 kilometers of Pokrovsk at the cost of thousands of casualties. So I don't see the Russians having the ability to overrun Ukrainian defenses or exploit any local successes that they have achieved thus far. Again, very difficult for the Ukrainian troops that are there, but I don't see Russia having the ability to fully exploit their advantage while Ukraine focuses on their counteroffensive towards Kursk.
Okay, so let's focus on Kursk now, because that's very interesting. Big surprise. We're in our third week, and it looks like about probably over 1,200 square kilometers has been captured, is being held on to currently. So, looking at the situation, in week 3, what do you think that Ukraine has accomplished at the bare minimum at this point?
3 things immediately come to mind. Number one, they have changed the momentum and the narrative of this conflict. For the last few months, it's been kind of negative, and there are some doomers out there, I call them, in Washington and some other capitals that have said there's no way Ukraine can win, Russian victory is inevitable. And I think this counteroffensive by Ukraine has proven that Russian victory is not inevitable and that Ukraine still has terrific capability. That's number one. Number two, the Russian response has been slow, ineffective, incoherent almost. They'll eventually get more forces there, but the fact that they have not reacted more quickly and with greater effect is a reflection on the fact that they have a really mixed up command and control structure with general staff and FSB and Rosguardia and border forces, all of whom hate each other, and there's big distances involved, and so they have not been able to shift forces quick enough yet to have an impact. And then the third thing I would say is this counteroffensive has changed the geography of the conflict, in that now Ukraine is able to not only disrupt Russian logistics and Russian oil and gas infrastructure and put pressure on Russian decision makers, they can now also bring their own long-range precision weapons further into Russia and start hitting targets like airfields and other Russian logistics sites that were out of range before now.
It seems that also this whole red line concept of that we have in the West, that we can't provoke Russia too much, and especially in an operation like this. I mean, this is on Russian territory. Do you think that this operation is going to help Western policymakers potentially maybe go back on their own red lines that they have arbitrarily set for Ukrainian armed forces?
I surely hope so. These red lines, I'm glad you brought this up, because these red lines are self-imposed. We are deterring ourselves because of excessive, unnecessary fear that Russia might use a nuclear weapon. And the Russians have seen that. And so we continue to hesitate to provide Ukraine what's needed to win. We don't even say the words, we want Ukraine to win, even though it's to our strategic advantage if Ukraine does defeat Russia. And so I hope that this demonstration of Ukrainian courage and professional competence, and the fact that they are well inside of Russia, and Russia is unable to, at least so far, adequately and properly respond, should put people at ease that somehow if you set one foot inside Russia or shoot one rocket inside Russia, they're going to use a nuclear weapon. That's obviously not the case.
Right. Now, the border areas are also interesting in that Ukraine was able to exploit this area that was not very well defended, many conscripts in the area. How does that play out on potentially a new strategy by Ukraine to exploit these weak zones that are essentially only separated by a line on a map?
So another good question. We don't know the ultimate objective of the Ukrainian government or the general staff here, nor should we know. We're not entitled to know what their plans are. But it looks like they have created this bridgehead with their counteroffensive inside Russia that is, number one, disruptive, as we've already discussed. It denies Russia an area from which the Russians used to attack Ukrainian cities and kill innocent people. So now that area is being denied. But it also provides a bridgehead, a jumping off place, if you will, for further development of this in multiple directions. I don't think that this is a standalone event. I mean, this is such a significant operation they've undertaken. At the same time, they still are launching long-range precision strikes against Russian oil and gas infrastructure. They just sank a ferry down in the port of Kavkaz near Kerch. They are disrupting Russian rail lines. So there's a lot of things that are happening, not just this counteroffensive. So I think this is part of something bigger, whether it is an attack along another part of the border or an expansion of what they're doing now. I think the Ukrainians will have thought through. They know this area so well. They know the people. They know the geography. They'll have thought through the possibilities, the risks, and anticipated Russian reactions. So I think we're going to learn a lot more in the coming week.
Yeah, and it seems to me that this gives them the initiative and really has Russians on their toes. They don't know where the next strike could be, which seems to play out in their favor.
Yeah, very well said. This is a momentum changer. Now, how long the momentum changes will depend somewhat on Russian response and on Ukraine's ability to sustain what it is they're doing. But now you've got the Russians on the back foot. Hopefully, they will begin to shift forces away from their operations in the Procr region and try and bring them around towards Kursk. That's going to take some time. I was on my map yesterday trying to figure out how would they do that, how long would it take. We're talking about several hundreds of kilometers from, let's say, the Procr region around to Zhuja. And it's not a straight, easy road. They would require hundreds of trucks and or rail cars. You know, they can do it, but it's not going to happen fast. And especially since they were caught by surprise, they're not prepared yet to make that kind of movement. And that will come at a cost to supporting other things. So we'll see how they respond, if they choose to respond. They've still got FSB in charge of dealing with Kursk, General Staff in charge of the Pokrovsk operation. General Staff hates the FSB and is probably not going to be in a hurry to give up forces to the FSB to deal with this.
We've seen reports, we've seen footage of Russians preparing bomb shelters and what have you in the city of Kursk. Do you think that that's kind of a prelude to that they're expecting to even lose more ground in that area? Also, Vladimir Putin has ordered his forces to retake the Kursk region by October 1st. Is that an arbitrary timeline, do you think? Is that doable?
I think the fact that people in Kursk are panicking a little bit is indicative of how detached they have been from the reality of this war. Now they're feeling it. I don't know how far the Ukrainians intend to go. Again, we don't know the end state or the intended outcome from the Ukrainian side, but a couple of things that Ukraine has achieved here that is going to cause problems for the Russians is, number one, the seizure of the major gas hub there in Zhuja, which is through which Russian gas passes to several European countries. This will be a problem for Ukraine or for Russia if Ukraine either disables it or turns it off. I don't know that they will, but they control it. Similarly, in the Kursk region, not too far beyond where the Ukrainian troops are located, is the nuclear power plant in Kursk. If Ukraine is able to capture that, gain control of that, now you've got a situation where the Ukrainians control a Russian nuclear power plant. The Russians are still sitting in Zaporizhia. You know, perhaps there's potential here for down the road exchanging, returning control to each other's nuclear power plant, or at least creating energy problems for Russians in Moscow and south of Moscow if the Ukrainians are able to gain control of that nuclear power plant. So there's a lot of things going on here. None of this is a surprise to the Ukrainian General Staff.
I think at the onset of this operation, we were all, well, of course, there was a lot of speculation going on, but we're all hoping that it would relieve some of the hotter spots along the front lines. You just gave us your opinion on the Procr direction. But is there any evidence so far that indeed certain areas of the front line have been evacuated, some of the personnel have been moved over to go and respond to the situation in Kursk? Has it taken any of the pressure off of the front lines for the Ukrainians?
Not yet that I have seen. Now, again, keep in mind the distances we're talking about, and also who's in charge. You don't have one clearly established command authority that can say, they can point to his commander in the east and say, I want you to shift over these capabilities over to the Kursk region. You've got a disjointed command and control system. And so for any movement to start happening, somebody has to make the decision that something needs to be done. And that needs to be done should include Air Force or land forces or whatever. So I don't know where they are, the Russians, where they are in that process of figuring out who actually has the authority to do things. Clearly, Putin does not have any confidence in Gerasimov. So it's hard to figure out who's making the decisions and who has the authority to start assembling trains and trucks that would be required for a movement. I have heard that some Russian units in the vicinity of Zaporizhzhia were going to be relocated. I don't know how they're going to do that. It's going to take some time, and to move enough people to actually make a difference, that show up with ammunition and fuel and capabilities that would be needed to counter the Ukrainian positions there in the Kursk area. I haven't seen that yet. They could be on the road. I haven't seen it yet.
Doing so, though, would present unique opportunities for Ukrainian forces, would it not? That they would be able to target massive forces that would otherwise not be massed up.
Yeah, exactly. I would hate to be a Russian truck driver right now. These convoys, these movements, once they start moving, are going to be targeted with drones or long-range strike. You're going to have, this is hard. Logistically, even in ideal situations, it's hard to get enough capability to move all your forces. The Russians have lost hundreds and hundreds of trucks over the last 2.5 years that are not so easily replaced. Each of them requires drivers, maintenance, fuel, etc. So it's harder to move, to actually do it, especially pulling out of one combat situation and going to another combat situation if you haven't been preparing for it. So I don't know how fast or how quickly they'll do it. They'll eventually do it. At some point, just time and brute force, they'll start moving stuff. But again, I think the Ukrainians will have anticipated this and we'll see opportunity in some of this.
All right, General Ben Hodges, thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week and shedding light on all these developments we're seeing in Kursk. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks for the privilege.
And that concludes this week's edition of Ukraine This Week. Thanks for joining us. And of course, if you ever missed the show, you can check it out on YouTube. We'll see you again next week. Goodbye.